The wind clawed at the shutters of Eleanor Harper's cabin, carrying with it the scent of pine, snow, and the distant threat of wolves. Winter had settled over the Colorado frontier like a heavy blanket, and the silence inside her cabin was thick with more than just cold. Eleanor stood by the hearth, watching the fire devour the last of the split logs. Her hands were raw from chopping wood, her back ached from hauling water, and her heart, well, that pain was less visible, but far more persistent. Caleb had been gone nearly a year now. The army said ambush. Cavalry insignia returned in a folded flag, but they hadn't sent back the man she'd married. Just a pine box and a silence too heavy for words. She lived now in that silence. Alone. That afternoon, while checking the woodshed, Eleanor noticed something amiss. Blankets had been disturbed. The snow near the door was slightly trampled. At first, she thought it was a fox or perhaps a neighbor's dog seeking shelter. Then she saw the blood. A streak across the floorboards, half frozen, leading behind the stacked firewood. Heart pounding, she reached for the old rifle by the door, cocked it with shaking fingers, and approached. Behind the logs, slumped in the shadows, was a man, dark-skinned, bare-chested beneath a torn wool blanket, his eyes closed and his lips pale from cold. An Apache. Eleanor gasped and leveled the rifle, but her hands trembled too hard to hold steady. The man didn't flinch. He was unconscious, or nearly dead. She should have run, or fetched the sheriff. That's what Sarah Millstone would have done, what any God-fearing widow ought to do. But Eleanor stood there, watching his chest rise in shallow rhythm. He was young, maybe 30, with long black hair tangled over his shoulders and an open wound just below his ribs. She lowered the rifle. Minutes later, he lay on the cabin's floor near the fire, the scent of blood mixing with smoke. Eleanor worked in silence, cleaning the wound, wrapping it tightly. He didn't wake, didn't speak, just breathed barely. By dusk, the snow had thickened, and she wondered what story she'd tell if someone came knocking. But no one did. People rarely visited widows, and they never stayed long. The next morning, she awoke to rustling. The Apache man sat upright near the hearth, his eyes scanning the room with animal alertness. He didn't reach for a weapon. He had none, but his gaze met hers with quiet defiance. "I'm not your enemy," she said before she could stop herself. His eyes narrowed. He spoke one word, harsh and thickly accented. "Water." She brought him a tin cup. He drank slowly, eyes never leaving her face. "You're lucky I didn't leave you out there," she muttered, more to herself. He said nothing, just nodded once, curt and unreadable. "Name?" she asked. He hesitated. Then Taza. She didn't offer hers. Over the next days, the storm deepened. So did the silence between them. Taza remained seated or sleeping, conserving strength. Eleanor kept her distance, but couldn't help watching him. His movements were deliberate, efficient. When he finally rose, limping, to fetch his own water, he did so with a dignity that unsettled her. Why was she doing this? What would Caleb think? The man lying in her home was the same kind of warrior who may have killed her husband. She should feel hatred, but all she felt was the ache of uncertainty. One evening, as she ladled stew into a bowl, she caught him watching her. Not with threat, but with something more complex, curiosity, maybe, or gratitude, or pity. "You're not safe here," she said quietly. "If someone finds you, they'll hang you. And I'll hang with you for harboring." He looked into the fire. "I go soon." "Where?" she challenged. He didn't answer. The flames crackled. Snow tapped at the windows like impatient fingers. "You saved me," he said finally. "Why?" Eleanor didn't have a good answer. Not then. She just said, "I was tired of burying people." For the first time, something like understanding passed between them. No smiles, no warmth, just an unspoken truce. But truce was a fragile thing in the winter wilds. And as the wind howled outside, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that her simple act of mercy would cost her more than she could yet imagine. Snow had melted into mud by the time word spread through the valley. Eleanor Harper had taken in a savage. The rumors began with Sarah Millstone, as most trouble did. She'd spotted a shadow moving in Eleanor's window at dawn, far too tall and broad to be a woman's. Within hours, she arrived with the self-righteous fury of a preacher and the eyes of a hawk. "I came to check on you, dear," Sarah said sweetly, though her boots didn't stop at the door. "You've been so quiet lately." Eleanor stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "I prefer quiet." Sarah leaned in, eyes sweeping the cabin's interior. "Strange. I thought I saw movement. Do you have company?" "No," Eleanor said flatly. "Just the wind and my chores." But that small delay, that subtle breath before her lie, was enough. Sarah's eyes sharpened. She didn't press, not then. She simply smiled and left, skirts rustling like dry leaves. By dusk, the soldiers came. Major Whitcomb rode with 3 men, boots splattered in red mud and expressions carved from stone. They entered without permission. Taza stood by the hearth, upright now, wrapped in Eleanor's dead husband's coat. The soldiers raised their rifles. Eleanor stepped between them. "He's not armed. He hasn't hurt anyone." "Ma'am," Whitcomb said, ignoring her protest, "you're harboring an enemy of the United States. That carries a hanging offense." Taza didn't move, didn't speak. Eleanor's voice broke through the tension. "He was wounded, dying. I didn't know who he was at first. That excuse won't protect you. Then let me give you a better one." She surprised herself with the next words. "He's my husband." The silence was deafening. Whitcomb's brow lifted. "Excuse me. We married. Common law. That gives me the right to shelter him." It was a lie, a desperate one, but the soldiers hesitated. Common law marriages were loosely recognized out here, especially when used to legitimize property claims. One of the privates muttered, "She's within her rights, sir." Whitcomb frowned, but his hands dropped. "You'll both report to Fort Doyle. We'll make this official, if it's true." The next day, under a pale sun and surrounded by uniformed men, Eleanor stood in front of a rusted chapel with Taza beside her. There was no priest, just a military clerk reciting vows by rote and scribbling signatures into a book no one would ever read. Taza didn't speak during the ceremony. He simply stood still, eyes watching her with unreadable intensity. When the soldier prompted him for assent, he nodded once. Eleanor said, "I do," with a voice that felt borrowed. Afterward, they returned to her cabin, their cabin now, in silence. That night, she couldn't sleep. Taza sat on the edge of the bed, back turned to her. "This wasn't my choice," she said softly. He didn't look at her, nor mine. A beat passed between them. "You could have run," she added. "You should have. I stayed because you kept me alive." She couldn't tell if it was gratitude or resentment in his voice. Days passed. The town avoided her. Sarah stopped coming by. At the general store, conversation ended when Eleanor entered. Children whispered and pointed. Back home, Taza fixed the broken roof without being asked. He cleaned his own wounds, gathered firewood, and said little. Yet somehow, the silence between them changed. It wasn't as heavy. It held space, not distance. One evening, she found him outside, watching the stars. "Why didn't you tell him I was lying?" she asked. Taza glanced at her. "You gave me a name, a place. I had none before." Eleanor didn't respond. She didn't know how. She went to bed first, and for the first time, she didn't hear him follow hours later. Instead, his shadow passed the doorway minutes after hers, quiet as breath. When she closed her eyes, she didn't think of Caleb. Not immediately. Not with the same ache. She thought of Taza, of his silence, his restraint, the quiet dignity with which he bore their mutual entrapment. They were married by law, if not love. But the law had its own gravity, and in that quiet orbit, something had begun to shift. The winter days stretched on, each one a mirror of the last. The snow had packed the earth solid, the land a frozen expanse of white and gray. Eleanor and Taza worked in quiet tandem, their lives an unspoken rhythm. He repaired the cabin, mended fences, tended the horses. She chopped wood, cooked meals, and kept the fire burning. The silence between them had become less oppressive, more familiar, though still distant. Neither spoke of the forced marriage, and neither mentioned Caleb's memory again. Yet the shadow of the past hung heavy in the air, unacknowledged but ever present. One evening, as the last light of day bled out over the horizon, Eleanor stood at the stove, stirring a pot of stew. The smell of simmering meat and herbs filled the cabin, but her thoughts were elsewhere, swirling like the wind outside. "You're quieter than usual," Taza remarked from the corner, where he was sharpening his knife with deliberate strokes. Eleanor glanced at him over her shoulder. "Is that so? Something is different." His voice was low, thoughtful. She couldn't deny it. She felt it too, though she didn't want to. The subtle tension that had begun to weave between them, thickening like the fog rolling over the mountains. It wasn't just the proximity, the daily closeness forced by the marriage. It was something more, something deeper, more dangerous. "I'm just tired," she said, her voice too soft to carry conviction. "The days are long." Taza didn't respond immediately. He set his knife down on the table with a soft thud. "I do not know why you stay," he said suddenly, as though the thought had finally broken through his careful reserve. Eleanor paused, her hand stilling in midair as she stirred the stew. She didn't want to turn around, didn't want to face the weight of his gaze, but she did. "Because I have no choice," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't look at her with anger or judgment, just a quiet kind of understanding that made her skin prickle. His gaze lingered for a moment, a weight in his eyes that seemed to reach into her very soul. He stood then, slowly, and walked toward her. Eleanor's breath hitched. His presence loomed near her, and for the first time, she noticed the way the dim firelight made his features sharper, more defined, his jaw, his cheekbones, the way the dark shadows played across his face, making him seem less like an enemy and more like something else. He reached past her, toward the cupboard, to retrieve a plate. Their arms brushed lightly, a touch so subtle it might have been imagined, but it burned through her like a live wire. "I didn't ask for this," she said suddenly, breaking the silence between them. "Any of it. I didn't ask to be stuck here with you, in this godforsaken place." Taza met her eyes, his gaze unwavering. "Nor I." The air seemed to thicken between them, heavy and charged. Eleanor wanted to step back, to regain her space, but something in his stare held her in place, rooted to the floor. He didn't need to say anything. His silence said everything. The unspoken words hung in the air like the last flickers of a fire before it went out. "I never wanted to feel this way," she murmured, almost to herself. "I never wanted to feel anything for you." His voice was quiet, raw. "But you do." She felt a flicker of heat in her chest, not from the fire, but from something deeper, something more primal. He wasn't wrong. She had tried to deny it for days, weeks now, but the truth had come crashing through. She cared for him in a way she shouldn't, in a way that should have been impossible. He was the enemy, the killer of men like her husband. Yet here she was, standing in a cabin she had once shared with a man who had never truly seen her, looking at another man who had done nothing but survive. "I should hate you," she said, though the words were hollow, disconnected from the truth of her feelings. "I should want to drive you away." Taza stepped closer, so close that his warmth radiated into her skin. "Then why do you stay?" Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't have an answer. She couldn't explain it, this tangled knot of guilt, longing, and defiance that twisted within her. Before she could speak, he moved, his hand coming to rest gently on her arm. It wasn't an action filled with lust. It was careful, deliberate, as though he was afraid she would break beneath his touch. "Tell me you don't feel it," he said softly, his breath warm against her ear. "Tell me you don't want this." Eleanor's heart thundered in her chest. She could hear it, the frantic beat of it, but those words wouldn't come. The truth was too close now, too raw to deny. She turned to face him, eyes wide, lips parted, and in that instant, everything between them shifted. The walls that had kept them apart crumbled away, and there was nothing left but the unbearable tension, the yearning that had built between them, silent and undeniable. "I don't know what this is," she whispered, her voice shaking. "But I can't keep pretending it doesn't matter." Taz's hand slid down her arm to rest on her waist, pulling her just a fraction closer. The world outside seemed to vanish, leaving nothing but the heat between them, the space they had never filled until now. The first spring thaw came early. Trees wore a delicate veil of green, and the air smelled of wet soil and quiet promise. Yet inside the cabin, peace had not settled. Eleanor stood near the window, watching the snowmelt carve shallow rivers through the yard. Behind her, Taza split logs, each strike of the axe deliberate and smooth. The memory of that night, when they had nearly crossed the threshold between duty and desire, lingered like smoke in a closed room. Neither had spoken of it since. They danced around it now, careful not to break the balance that had begun to form. Eleanor wore her hair loose more often. Taza began to speak in full sentences. Small things, quiet betrayals of the distance they once maintained. But every warmth was shadowed by the truth neither of them dared name. What they had was not born of love. It was born of obligation, of survival, of loss. Late one evening, as they shared bread and dried meat, Taza looked at her and asked, "Do you still dream of him?" Eleanor froze. "Caleb." Taza nodded. She set her knife down slowly. "I used to. Less now. Sometimes he's faceless. Just a shadow wearing his coat." Taza didn't look away. "You were loyal to him. I thought I was." Her voice faltered. "But I've changed. I had to." He studied her a moment longer, then returned to his meal. The moment passed, but the weight of it remained. 2 days later, a rider appeared on the ridge. Eleanor spotted him first, dusty coat, cavalry hat low over his brow, horse limping from the climb. She called for Taza, who emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. They watched the man approach in tense silence. He stopped a dozen paces from the porch. "Name's Lieutenant Grady. I need to speak with Mrs. Eleanor Harper." Eleanor stepped forward slowly. "I'm Eleanor." Grady's expression was tight, unreadable. "Your husband, Caleb Harper, he's alive." The ground seemed to tilt beneath her. "That's not possible," she said, voice hoarse. "They buried him. I saw the flag." "There was a mistake," Grady replied. "Captured by the Apache. Escaped last month. He's at Fort Doyle now. He's asked for you." Behind her, Taza was silent. Eleanor's hands trembled. The name, Caleb, once sacred, now felt foreign on her lips. "He wants me to come?" Grady nodded. "Tomorrow at dawn. I'll escort you myself." The lieutenant turned and rode off, leaving silence in his wake. Inside the cabin, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the worn floorboards. "I thought he was dead," she whispered. Taza remained standing, his arms crossed over his chest. "And now he is not." The finality in his voice unsettled her. "I should be happy," she said. "But you are not." She looked up at him, eyes glassy. "What am I supposed to do? Go back to him? Pretend none of this happened?" "You are his wife," Taza said, voice even. "Legally, you are always his." "And what about you?" she asked, more bitterly than she intended. "Do I just forget everything? Forget what we've built here?" His jaw tightened. "What we built was never meant to last." The word struck like a slap. She stood slowly. "Is that how you feel?" He hesitated. "I was grateful. You saved my life. I honored the marriage. But I am not the man your people want. And you," he stepped closer, "you deserve to choose. Not be forced." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "And if I choose you, you would lose everything." The room seemed too small for both of them, for the feelings trapped between them. "I can't go back to what I was," she whispered. "Not after this. Not after you." He reached for her then, not with passion, but with a quiet sorrow. His hand touched her cheek, his thumb brushing a tear that had escaped despite her will. "You must see him," he said. "Only then will you know." That night, she didn't sleep. She lay in bed alone, staring at the ceiling, while Taza sat outside by the dying fire, a silent sentry watching the stars fade to gray. At dawn, she saddled her mare and rode off with Lieutenant Grady, her heart caught between two lives, one she thought was over and one she never meant to begin. And behind her, the cabin stood still, a home half-formed, waiting to see which part of her would return.